I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom. Let's talk.
Welcome back to Queer Kids Straight Mom. I am coming to you today from Summerlin, Nevada, in the midst of a camping trip. Sienna is at school as usual.
Yeah, it's boring. It's normal.
Today, we are going to talk about feminism and the role that it does or does not play in transgender rights. It seems that you can interpret it however you want to use for your purposes, or at least that's what people are doing.
Like just about anything, really.
Like just about anything. In the J.K. Rowling school of thought, transgender women are trampling all over the hard-won rights of women, what she calls real women. And and what did you just see?
Caitlyn Jenner, that thing?
Caitlyn Jenner, yes. Yeah, what was that? That was
wild. That was like, I have changed my birth certificate and my driver's license and my pilot's license and all of the things. So, like, technically, yes, I am a woman, but also I am not a woman.
Yeah, that was weird. I mean, I'm a woman, but I know I'm not biologically a woman.
Yeah, and so then when other trans women say, no, I'm a real woman, wow, that's so stupid. I know what a real transgender woman is, and it's not a real woman.
Yeah, that one was odd. So, as you can see, all across the spectrum, there are people who have different interpretations of what a real woman is and who is allowed to call herself that. You know, I mentioned this in the last podcast, kind of our lead into this, but I have talked to people that have been taken aback when their assigned female kids expressed an interest in exploring non-binary genders, that it felt like an affront to a
slap in the face to the hard work they'd done of raising a feminist household.
Yeah, something along those lines. Especially, one particular friend, like, she grew up in a family that was very, why would you go to college? You just need to, like, get married and have children. And, worked really hard to kind of defy that narrative and go out and meet her goals and become very educated and have a career. And so having a daughter who, what felt to her was sort of rejecting feminine qualities, was a little like, did I do something wrong? Did I make being female look bad somehow? I think it's especially probably leading up to your generation, because I certainly feel this way, that, like, there were a lot of stereotypes that women had to overcome, even when I was growing up, when things were, decent, but not, I mean, we have a long way to go still now. So not even as good as it is now when I was growing up. And so I have that sort of, little bit of chip on my shoulder that, like, women can do everything men can do. And I don't want to be seen as pretty good for a woman, or any of those kinds of things. And so I think a lot of us in my generation still have that. And so it is just a moment we have to take, where we're like, but I paved the way for this to be cool for you and you don't want it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that's a set of experiences that can come for a lot of different, marginalized groups. That feeling of, well, I fought so hard for this, and now my child is seemingly completely uninterested in embracing it. I understand where that's coming from. I think it's sort of a misunderstanding of when your kid comes to you and says, oh, this is how I identify. I think it's a little bit of a misunderstanding. I suppose in some ways it's almost like the same sort of thing, but reversed, as if you, and I imagine this is maybe what your friend was getting at, if you have grown up, being told that, oh, in order to be a powerful woman, you have to, like, wear a suit and cut your hair short and, like, be one of the guys. And that was a real thing, is that, and continues to be a real thing, is that feminine women, women who really embrace their femininity, who want to wear pink, like Legally Blonde, right, are treated as less intelligent and less qualified, which incidentally is something I ran into in debate, where I think because I was pretty masculine presenting as a debater, in a lot of ways, I would get fewer comments about the way I dressed or the way I presented myself, because I absolutely knew more feminine presenting debaters who got comments pretty regularly about the way they dressed and how long their skirt was and how their hair was styled and how they talked. And so that's definitely a mentality that exists. And I think, a lot of women in your generation spent a lot of time and effort trying to be like, no, I can like pink and like sparkles and like dresses and also be intelligent and also be strong and also be competent. And so then to have a kid who, is really embracing that more masculine aspect of either of their identity as a woman or as being non-binary, yeah, I get how that can feel weird. But at the same time, it's a little bit like, well, feminism is about letting people present themselves however they want, regardless of their gender, and not being assigned judgments for it. And so if you go assigning assumptions and judgments to your masculine presenting daughter, then ultimately you're just reinforcing the same stereotypes.
Right. Which, I mean, I'm also sympathetic to, because like you said, there's always that. I mean, I have had people say that they assumed I wasn't going to be smart until I started talking, because I like makeup and I like pink and I like feminine things. And yeah, so there's always something to overcome. And I do agree that making any kind of judgment on feminine, meaning really anything, is a slippery slope. And also, I was just thinking about this too, like having that reaction, like, is this a rebuke of feminism, is also sort of subconsciously making the judgment that it is a decision,
Mm-hmm.
that your
Yeah.
child is making a decision, not just expressing, I'm not deciding anything. I'm not turning my back on anything. This is just who I am.
And that's sort of what I was getting at with the idea that it's kind of a misunderstanding. And I do think, I definitely growing up had a little bit of like mentality of like, ugh, girls are so annoying and ugh, and like they're obsessed with their clothes and makeup is terrible. And it's definitely a thing that's still ingrained in, I think, that like that mentality of like not like other girls. So that was something that, I had to kind of work through and process. And, a lot of it was just like, oh, I'm going to recognize that people have depths and multitudes that aren't just expressed by how they present themselves to the world. But that doesn't mean that I figured that out and I suddenly stopped identifying as non-binary or I became a woman, right? Like that was an entirely sort of separate journey that's connected to my identity as non-binary and that influenced how I presented myself as non-binary, but it's ultimately two different tracks.
Yeah. Another argument that is presented as feminism in this lawsuit that we've just seen from a group of NCAA female athletes suing over the NCAA's transgender policies, because they are saying it violates their Title IX protections to allow transgender women to compete against them. You know the details far better than I do on the NCAA's requirements. Walk through some of those. So when we talk about transgender women competing, people know exactly what we're talking about.
It's a little bit like there are a lot of changes. We've been seeing sporting organizations change their rules a lot. First, becoming a little bit more open and more liberal. And then over the last couple of years, there's really been an attitude of like, oh, it's the problem and we need to address this and be more strict about things. So I don't know 100% where the NCAA is at this exact moment, but in general, there are requirements about how long an athlete has been presenting as their gender that they're competing in. There are rules about, have they changed documentation? Have they changed their name? That kind of thing. Like there are rules in place basically to make sure that it's not just some guy being like, ha ha ha, I'm gonna go compete with the women, but I'm still a man. That's not a thing. It's not a thing. And then also rules about like medical transition. And I'm actually going to Google this to make sure because I don't want to mix up the like Olympic rules and the NCAA rules. So as of 2022, the NCAA Board of Governors has had a policy that says that students have to have had trans women, obviously. Students have to have had 1 year of testosterone suppression treatment to be able to compete. So there are also rules about like how long you have been medically transitioning and how far along you are in that process.
So, like you said, this is not men saying, I'm going to co compete against the women. This is after transgender women have undergone physiological changes and met required testosterone levels to compete in women's sports.
Mhm.
Just to get that straight, because I think there are a lot of people that think you can just say, now I'm competing as a woman, and that's it. And that's unfair. And that, you know, from an objective standpoint, in a lot of ways would be unfair because we're talking about biological differences. However, and you and I have talked about this a lot, there are also a lot of biological differences within biological sex. There are a
Mhm.
lot of female born cisgender athletes that have naturally higher testosterone levels than the general population. And that gives them a natural advantage. There are male basketball players who are 7 feet tall. Not everybody's 7 feet tall. There's a biological advantage to being
Right.
7 feet tall.
Or, the example of Michael Phelps, which I always think is hilarious because he's apparently decided that he needs to protect women's sports. But like my dude has a wingspan that is way outside of average, as well as like I don't remember the biological details of this, but basically like his muscles produce lactic acid in a way that like causes him less pain than everybody else, and he's also able to process oxygen more efficiently than everybody else. So like, yeah, my dude, you're a professional level athlete, not because of any like personal moral superiority, but like because your body is outside of the norm. And that's ultimately the thing to me, right? Like, if we assume that transgender women are women, and if a transgender woman has been living as a woman, for years, is identifying as a woman in every other context, like she's a woman, then she happens to be a woman who has biological advantages, right? And in order to be consistent, if we take that as our baseline assumption, in order to then be consistent in our rules towards all athletes, we would basically have to say that, okay, we're going to draw a bell curve of every facet of your body that could possibly impact how you perform in your sport, and then say anyone at either end or at the top end of that bell curve is not allowed to compete because they have too much of a biological advantage, and that's too unfair. And that's like the natural result of that logic, right? If we assume that transgender women are women, then they're just women who might, right? The science on this is really, really ambiguous. And it turns out that there's a lot more factors that go into this than just like testosterone levels. The New York Times did some very interesting reporting on this about how actually testosterone doesn't always make as much difference as you think. A lot of women with elevated testosterone levels also have androgen insensitivity, which means that testosterone is not getting absorbed in the same way that it does for everybody else. So it's really complicated, and you can't say that just because she's a transgender woman, she has an unfair advantage. So it's very intellectually inconsistent, especially for someone like Michael Phelps to say this is unfair.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had conversations about this. Probably the most fair way for sports to deal with all of this is to just have, instead of men's and women's like leagues based on your performance, right?
Right.
Size or whatever, like you guys did as kids in Taekwondo, where like it was based on your size.
Right. And that would, not only eliminate the entire transgender controversy nonsense, but also, allow non-binary athletes to compete comfortably. Like you really wanted me to do track and field in high school. And part of it, I was just like, I'm so overwhelmed and tired all the time. But part of it was also, I was like, but I don't want to compete in women's. That makes me uncomfortable. So, it would eliminate that problem. And also, it would allow women who are really, really high performing to compete with the best athletes, not the best female athletes, but the best athletes all around. And that's what gets me about this argument that this is somehow about feminism is like, no, this is not feminism. You are deliberately hurting yourselves. You're saying that, oh, because I'm a woman, I can't possibly compete with the best athletes. I need my own separate special category.
Watching the 3-point competition at the All-Star weekend and all the people that were like, well, Sabrina Ionescu should have used the women's 3-point line. She gave him a run for his money.
Right. That wasn't anyone gets it competition.
And she did it at the same line as he did.
And
I thought that was awesome that she wasn't like, no, it's only fair if I get my own line. She was like, I can shoot as well as Steph Curry. Bring it on.
Well, not to mention that if you took the way that she performed in that competition with Steph Curry and put her in like the NBA All-Star 3-point competition generally, she would have been, I don't remember what it was, but it was like second, third, like really good. She would have beaten everybody else.
Yeah, she crushed it. And I love that because to me, feminism, if I were an elite athlete at anything, I would want to compete against the best. I don't want qualifications. Like if somebody beats me, it's because they're a better swimmer than I am, better runner, better basketball, whatever.
Well, and I think it's because we have this sort of myth that's all tied up with the, pull yourself up by your bootstraps nonsense, like the American dream of if you work hard and do what you're supposed to, your hard work will beat anybody else's inborn advantages. And like, we know that that's not true. And that mythology is what prevents people with like who are born into really difficult circumstances from receiving the social help that they need, is because people are like, well, you should just try harder. Why aren't you trying harder? And so I think that then creates this myth in athletics that like, if you try really hard, then you can beat all the other athletes. And like, that's not true in men's or women's. Like, ultimately, you can try really hard. And sometimes people are like most people can't compete with Steph Curry. I was just reading a training for rock climbing book, and, it's talking in the introduction, like, probably no matter how hard you train, you're never going to climb a 515. Because the people who are elite climbers, right, your Chris Sharmas and your Alex Honnolds, they have like their bodies are built differently, right? They have different forearm muscle placements and different ways of processing pain.
How does that work in climbing competitions? Is it men and women also?
Well, let me tell you. Yeah, generally they will divide so like at the Olympic level, it's men and women. Generally, your bouldering comps or whatever, those will be men and women. But it's a little bit mystifying to me, actually, that they do that because climbing happens to be a sport where the sex difference is minimal, if not sometimes reversed, because it's all sort of about your muscle ratio to body mass, which isn't just like more muscle is good. Sometimes more muscle actually isn't that helpful in climbing. Being tall a lot of times isn't that helpful when you get to really advanced levels of climbing. And quite a lot of it is, it's a puzzle, right? It's more understanding how to approach a problem than just brute strengthening your way through it. And so again, right, you've got your Chris Sharmas and your Alex Honnolds who are going to perform at a level that like us average mortals can never hope to touch. But once you then take those elite climbers and put them kind of together, it's the sex difference is pretty minimal. So as an example, there's this show on HBO called The Climb. It has Jason Momoa and Chris Sharma. It's quite entertaining. I enjoyed it. It takes basically some world-class amateur climbers, incidentally, a couple of whom are from Montana and one of whom is from Utah, which is kind of fun. And the one who's from Utah is a woman who ended up being in the top 3 in the competition. Like the final three episode was her and like a super buff dude, and then like a 5'1" maybe, like pretty short transgender guy. That literally the most representative top 3 you could possibly have. So yeah, it's there was like a whole drama thing recently about like the climbing youth circuit implementing rules about who can compete in which gender category, and everyone was like, but why?
Yeah.
Like you're just jumping on the transphobia train for no reason. Like it makes no sense.
Because it's not that
Even if
relevant.
we right, even if we assume like, oh, trans women have advantages in some sports and blah blah blah, like it's not relevant in climbing.
Yeah, I remember dad telling me once too that women tend to have more lower body strength, and a lot of times men are trying to rely on their upper body strength on climbs when it would actually be much more helpful to use their legs.
Right. Like that's always what I run into with climbing is, I do lean more towards upper body strength. That's something I find easier to develop. So it's always in climbing, Irene is like way better at climbing than me, even though she's way less muscular than me and 5 inches shorter than me. Like she kicks my butt.
Yeah, I just thought of that because we're camping, at this place with like world class climbing and just going out there and seeing the groups of people. I was just kind of thinking about that whole gender thing in climbing because certainly a lot more women doing it than used to. And so I was just wondering if that was an issue in climbing as well, which it sounds like everybody's jumping on like you said, on the bandwagon.
It is funny. I remember, I went on a climbing trip down to Joe's Valley recently with a queer climbing group. And so I had my group of people that I got to the boulders with. And then when we got there on warm-up boulders, there were some guys already there climbing. And this one dude's like trying to do this super like crimpy, teeny handholds climb, and he's like and then like falls off, and then they like pack up and move, and then this like tiny little girl, not like young, but like very small, petite woman in our group gets on and just like boop, 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 pops right up to the top. No screaming, no nothing.
We've ended up talking about climbing possibly more than our topic, but
It's
okay,
relevant.
it is relevant and interesting and very interesting.
Mostly sports are all a different matrix of how hard you work, but also how your body's built. And sometimes people are going to be built different.
I mean, I think it just reflects a cultural place that we are right now where people think that, oh, well, if somebody beat you, if somebody's better than you, it's because they have an unfair advantage, like across the board. If the other guy won the election, obviously there was cheating at the ballot boxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just the way it is. So I guess it shouldn't really surprise us that there is a group of athletes that have grown up in this culture that this isn't fair. We would be the best if only not for this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then, as I mentioned before, J.K. Rowling, obviously, in the whole line of trans exclusionary radical feminists, it's just mystifying to me. I don't know. It's that thing like we were talking about with marginalized groups that like the feminism that I idealized is not a members only club where like if you meet my definition of a proper woman, you are allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what that seems to be.
Well, and not to mention the idea that womanhood is defined by your vagina.
Yeah.
Womanhood is defined by your ability to give birth. Motherhood is defined by whether or not you gave birth to a child.
There's a lot of what's called feminism that is actually like very limiting in its definitions and scope,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is the opposite of the spirit. Personally, it's just this constant changing landscape where the people that were progressive can start to be less progressive. And I suppose it's that thing that's always a danger of the segment of the population that as soon as they get rights, don't want other people to have rights. It's like now that we're in the club, we don't want everybody in the club. We worked hard to get here. So,
Log cabin Republicans.
mhm. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too. This also, and we've talked about this, right? This idea that like, oh, women are inherently inferior and will never be as good as men at sports. But I mean, we have no idea what like the peak women's potential is. Like, think about the hundreds of years of like women not being allowed to do anything competitive, being kept inside, not getting any opportunities. And then, 150 years ago, we start developing professional sports as a thing, and women are completely excluded. And then we start including women very slowly. And then even now, if you look at the funding that goes into women's sports, the opportunities that young girls have, like the likelihood that young girls drop out of athletics is much higher than young boys. The resources that they're given as young girls, much lower than boys. Like there is oh, and not to mention that sports medicine, this was really interesting. I was reading a newsletter about this a couple months ago, but sports medicine revolves almost entirely around men. It's all based on data from men's bodies. And so there are things like, oh, a lot of women have knees that are oriented slightly differently than men's. A lot of assigned female people than assigned male people, right? And so when you design sports shoes, they support the knee differently. And we're designing shoes all based off of assigned male bodies, never assigned female bodies. And so you have higher likelihoods of certain kinds of injuries in assigned female players. Like it's wild when you start getting into the nitty gritty of this. And so, like, for all we know, assigned female athletes could be competing at the exact same level as assigned male athletes all the time, right? But there are so many like disparities in the resources that are available that it's like you're making this assumption that, oh, it's a problem with women. Women are just weak and can't compete with men. When we haven't even gotten rid of all of the forms of discrimination attacking assigned female people in athletics. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, good point. So bottom line, feminist athletes, raise the bar higher, try to aim higher. Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, so to bring all of this together in full circle, if you are a feminist parent and your child is talking about other gender experiences, probably what it means is that you did your job right and raised a kid that is open minded and progressive and sees the world as full of possibility for all people.
And feels that you have created an environment where they feel like they can express that.
Exactly. That is not a referendum on you not having done a good job as a feminist. It means A plus, well done.
Don't like screw it up by being like, no, that's anti-feminist of you.
Right. You did well. Don't blow it now. All right. We have discussed some fairly heavy, weighty topics lately. So, next episode, we have decided to have some fun. We're going to look at some of the most popular TV shows and movies of the past decade and play a little game we call But Make It Gay.
I'm so excited for this because every time I watch a popular thing, I'm like, okay, this was fine, but you know what would make it better? Yay.
So if anybody has any ideas, recommendations, storylines you would love to see adapted to the gay, let us know in the next couple of weeks and we will try to add them to the lineup. Happy spring. Hope spring is treating you all well, and we will catch you next time.
Bye. If you found this podcast helpful, interesting, or just mildly amusing, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us to get the word out there and spread this information as far as we can.
And as always, check out our website at queerkidsstraightmom.com or visit us on Facebook, Queer Kid Straight Mom, Instagram at queerkid.straightmom, or Twitter at queerkidstr, the number 8 mom.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.